Hello everyone, this is Mike Steckline, partner with the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be covering a topic entitled Managing for Daily Improvement System, Part 1. I envision this will be one of a couple webinars on this topic, so I appreciate you participating today and participating in the discussion. Just a few housekeeping items. Right now I have the phones on mute. I will be pausing in the middle of the webinar at least 3 times to solicit input from anyone on the webinar. This webinar will be recorded as well, so you'll have access to the recording as well as can forward it on to other folks that you would like to share this with. So I want to start this discussion off today with today's webinar with a typical view that we look at the organization. Most people, if you ask them to describe where they are in an organization, they might draw a picture like this. And it's a useful way to look at the organization. You can find the different roles in the organization this way, categorized into 3 groups: leaders, managers, and frontline staff. And of course, everyone's desire is to work together toward customers, either internal or external customers, in the work that they do. In one of our white papers, we talked about a way to think about this view of the organization, and we called the paper side-by-side management. You can see the link to the white paper there. But what we did was thought about the organization this way: a simple adjustment to turn it counterclockwise this way, and to put the roles across this direction, to think about what are the roles of leaders, what are the roles of the managers, what are the roles of the front line. And building on that, we subsequently talked about where would you see people spending their time in the ideal state. And the first question to ask is, where do people typically spend their time currently? Now, this is probably a drastic view about what that may look like. Where do leaders spend their time? Where do managers spend their time? Where does the front line spend their time? In our discussions with many organizations, it does feel like a lot of time spent on firefighting, workarounds, and heroic efforts. There is time devoted to working on developing and communicating strategy, designated by the diagonal line in the upper left-hand corner. And in many organizations that we work with, we see that in discussions with leaders, they do attempt and try to devote time to strategy, but it seems to be not as much as they would like to, and certainly they get pulled into the daily problem in firefighting that then takes it away from the work that they would like to be doing in that regard. So we draw a picture this way, put a diagonal in the middle of the organization, and think about, in the ideal world, where might people in these various roles ideally be spending their time? And we break it up into 2 major triangles. Upper left-hand side, thinking strategically, positioning the organization for the future, preparing the organizations for the problems of tomorrow. And on the bottom lower right, think about it as the problems of today. Some people might describe it as operations, and providing value to the customers. Again, internal customers as well as external customers. So that's kind of a conceptual view of looking in the ideal world, where would people be spending their time. And building on that, we've talked a little bit about what kinds of systems might you see in an organization, and talk about a management system. We think about it in a couple ways. So building on that visual, thinking in terms of, if you had a strategic system preparing the organization for the future, answering questions like, what business are we in? What business should we be in? How do we develop strategies? How do we deploy those strategies? And how do we monitor those strategies? Again, thinking that you would want a good chunk of that time being in the role of leaders leading the work. They need to own that system. And managers needing to be able to translate the strategic to the front line. And accordingly, you might see various levels of activities and behaviors that people are exhibiting in those 3 roles relative to the strategic. Again, the lower right-hand side, looking at how you would be spending, how people would be spending their time. The front line would be spending more of their time thinking about how do they look at their work systems, align them for the organizations, how they are really enabled to improve the work, and how they go about improving the work, again, solving the problem for the day. There's this middle zone that we've carved out, and to think about standard work. This concept of standard work, a lot of resources written on that. And we're going to say a little bit about that in this webinar and in the future as we get into a future presentation on leader standard work. But thinking of leader standard work might fit in this category in the yellow zone. What is the work of leaders? What is the work of managers? And what part of it are they trying to standardize, to try to devote time to connecting to the strategy, as well as devoted to supporting the daily improvement. And then the type of standard work that you might see at the frontline level in terms of this is doing the work, and you would see more standard work the closer you get to the customer. And then this is improving the work. So improving the work being seen as part of the work. So the topic in the upper left-hand corner, the strategy system, was a topic of our most recent white paper. You can see it at the bit.ly link there. We called it the Pracademic's Guide to Strategy Deployment. And we had a couple of webinars on that topic. And the topic for today is going to be focused on this lower right-hand triangle, the Managing for Daily Improvement system. So just setting the tone for what do we want to focus on today in this webinar. Before we get into that, I want to talk a bit about some of the experience that we've noticed and things we've seen relative to improvement by events. Now, most people that get involved with this improvement work are familiar with events. An event could be a group of people organized to tackle a particular problem, to go through some activities. They may be involved for a period of time, say a couple days, maybe even a week, to really devote time and study something to try to make a substantial improvement. So for any particular process, we think of this in this terms. You see on the bottom axis over time, some measure improvement on the vertical axis, and then a period of performance that you might see in any sort of a process, and then how events can help to make improvement. Let's say improvement is up toward the up level. You would say you could make improvements over a period of time, and the idea is that's one way to get the performance of the process, whatever process or system you're working on, to be going in the direction you want it to be through some event improvement. Now, what we've noticed, and this has been supported in the literature by many people, if you're familiar with the work of Jim Lancaster, wrote a book titled The Work of Management. It's a book published by the Lean Enterprise Institute. And in the foreword of that book, James Womack describes this phenomenon that we've noticed too, that although people attempt to make improvements in this manner, there seems to be backsliding and degradation. Things don't always stay sustained. They go back to a previous level, perhaps not as low, but it's disappointing because it doesn't stay at the level of improvement that was gained through the improvement activity. So what do we do about that? And this positions ourselves to think about what is needed in addition to improvement by events in order to sustain the gains that are made. And this is where a sort of wedge needs to be built into this. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this, some sort of a wedge that would allow continuous improvement to occur and to minimize the deterioration of the improvement that occurs through improvement events. So you'll recognize that wedge as an example of what I just illustrated in the last couple slides. To see that it is this wedge that we're talking about, and that's what we're going to be talking about through the MDI, or the Managing for Daily Improvement system, in order to try to maintain the gains that are made through events. That's one way to think about an MDI system. So what I'd like to do before we move on, I said I was going to pause. I just want to pause and recap some things I've covered thus far, and then see if there's any input from the folks that are on the webinar today. So some key points. First of all, we talked about an adjustment in the typical way to view the organization, taking that view and building on that and thinking about where people currently spend their time and in the ideal state where they would spend their time. And then thinking about what kinds of systems would you need in order to support people spending their time and devoting their activities in the appropriate area, including a system for strategy development, deployment and monitoring, leader standard work, frontline standard work, and then managing for daily improvement systems. Briefly talked about the theory of what occurs through event improvement, the reality about how we see it, and then what we need to do to try to build a wedge to minimize any degradation of the improvement that does occur. So what I'd like to do, I'm going to unmute the phones right now and see how this compares to any experience that you have, or what would you add in addition to this as far as your experience. So what would you add or change? So I'm going to pause and see if there's any input from anyone on the call today. You can also type in on the chat function if you would like to weigh in on those two questions. Does this seem familiar to folks? The phenomenon of the backsliding and improvement? The current state of where people seem to be spending their time? How people think about standard work?
Yeah, I really like that graph. This is Alex Fetla from Whirlpool on just how to show how events and MDI can fit together. Sometimes we treat events as bad things, but I think together the two can be very powerful. So that really helps.
Great. Thanks for that input, Alex. Appreciate that. So several people have weighed in and said the backsliding does seem to be an important experience that people have, something that resonates with. And so this does seem to be something that needs to be addressed. It sounds like people have also had some experience with coupling events to managing for daily improvement, so that'll be useful for our discussion going forward. So what I want to do is proceed on and build on this a little bit and talk about, so managing for daily improvement, what is it that we're trying to work toward? Now this is merely one example. It's not the right way, it's just one way to think about it. We think in the middle about work systems, whatever work systems people are involved in. How are we trying to align those work systems, aligning the people that work in those work systems, really trying to enable them to carry out their work, to develop them to their full capability, and also really try to improve those work systems. So what might this look like as we fill this out? Well, one aspect is probably going to be working around alignment. What is it that we do in our area that connects to the work of the organization, and how are we performing relative to those important functions? Another aspect is probably talking about it, communicating, talking about status of our progress, not just one-way communication, but two-way, a real dialogue to help people to really understand, so what is it that we're doing, how are we performing? And as people talk about that, they'll notice that perhaps we're not where we need to be, or we need to do some things to maintain our stability, and they'll generate ideas. Problem identification can lead to problem solving, and people will work on not just some ideas to get to a better state, but also getting to root causes about what's causing the problem. Sometimes people will decide that they've discovered a new way to do something, or they realize that in order to make improvement they need to stabilize things. So they'll go about standardizing and stabilizing the work and trying to get everyone to agree that let's do it this new current way that we've decided we're going to do it. So a very simple outline of what a managing for daily improvement system might evolve to. So just a precursor to where we're headed as far as what this might look like. Now some definitions might be helpful, and we break it down this way. So this particular phenomenon, this system that we're talking about, comes by a lot of different names. People might know it as a lean daily management system, a daily engagement system. We break it down into these three words. So we think about it as a managing system. Someone is trying to manage certain things to try to accomplish certain things. So it is a managing system. It's performed daily and it needs to be built in on a daily ritual, daily routine. One thing that I've noticed is people will talk about having huddles, and that's great. What I'm really interested in is what's going on between the huddles. What kind of activities might that look like? Didier Rubino, lean sensei, friend and colleague here from the Twin Cities, contributes these thoughts in this particular definition here. Looking for signals for process deterioration. Where is it not being sustained? Making a plan for this day. What do we need to do to make adjustments for this day? And then working at improvement for tomorrow's performance. Didier is going to be providing a presentation on a webinar that we're hosting in May on leader standard work for the frontline leader. So just a precursor there, little commercial for the advice that Didier is going to offer in May. And then the final word is improvement. So any system has an aim, and we think about the aim of this system is for improvement. So it's not just doing the work, but it's trying to improving the work, thinking about it that way. But before we proceed with this and sort of break this down into how is this going to work, I want to think about a couple things. First of all, I want to think about a mindset before we get into this and back it up a little bit. And think in terms of gardening as a mindset versus thinking of like a machine. And I'll say a little bit more about that. But you put yourself in a mindset. What does a gardener do? A gardener tries some things, prepares the soil, plants some seeds, waters it, does some raking, does some weeding, and really tends to that garden to try to see what can I do to try to make this grow the way that I want it to be. So the first thing I want to try to express here is the mindset that we need to have when we're trying to think about evolving managing for daily improvement is to think more like a gardener and less like something you're trying to engineer or design in sort of a machine-like fashion. The next thing to think about is some sort of a framework or a foundation for doing some experimentation. And I'll say more about what I mean as far as a framework. And then the final point is to think about scaffolding, something that we're going to use to guide our experiments. So with scaffolding, it's something you put up. You can see these are bamboo scaffolds here, but something you put up as you're trying to build and improve a building. That scaffolding is going to go away, but the building's going to stay. So what kind of scaffolding might we need in order to guide the experiments we're going to have? So I want to say a little bit more about the mindset. First of all, something to keep in mind, systems tend to evolve. If we put the energy and the guidance into it, they're going to start simple and they're going to move to more complex. So what does that mean? Well, in the world that we talk about as far as making improvement, it might start off as a series of tools, such as huddles, using boards, tracking metrics, going on Gemba walks, experimenting with A3s or other sorts of problem-solving tools, using an X matrix, having some sort of standard work, either as a group or as individuals. So those are all examples of tools, and tools are great, tools are helpful, but over time, with guidance, those tools can start to form systems that you can start to see how they're connected and how some of those systems are going to help to align, how some of those systems are going to help to enable, and some are going to help to improve. And then, as it evolves, you'll start to see connections between those where say you've got a communication system that leads to problem-solving system, it really becomes integrated and smooth, and you less see the parts and more see how they're connected. And then finally, you're going to see some expansion in the organization. We notice this as, say, one area starts working on this and it connects to another area and people want to work together on this. It starts to become more about the way we do things, and those systems are becoming more predominant and apparent throughout the organization. So that's the sort of mindset of letting it evolve, encouraging it to evolve, that I wanted to build on, and we're going to be talking about that in a little bit more. The framework, part two, we want to build on what we call in our group the velocity model. So what do we mean by the velocity model? We know that if people predominantly think about improvement as the lower right-hand corner with we need to improve processes, we need to have tools and methods to improve processes, they'll push on one part of the three-pedaled system, but they are missing the other two pedals, which means you need to think about equal pressure on aligning the work, equal pressure on enabling people to do the work, and equal pressure on improving the work. So that's what I talk about as far as the framework. And the framework we're going to build on in the course of the rest of this webinar is to talk about how can we think about evolving a managing for daily improvement system by hanging things on this framework and thinking about the experiment that we would be doing. Now, I talked about scaffolding, and this is one way to think about scaffolding. So we introduced a method for design and improvement of systems that we wrote about in our Systems by Design white paper. You can see that link to that paper there. We teach courses on this, help people to design and improve specific systems. So it's one type of scaffolding. You'll notice an asterisk there. Another type of scaffolding is good coaching. So someone who's a mentor, who's a coach, who can help people, help to guide the work. When people are getting coaching and they're getting advice about what to do next, you can think about that as scaffolding, some sort of way to think about guiding the effort that you're pursuing to try to design and improve something. So we talked about mindset, thinking more like a gardener. We talked about a framework around align, enable, and improve, and we're going to be building on this idea of scaffolding and what that means. Now, another thing to think about here is we have observed people attempting to try to create an MDI system as a total and trying to make it work immediately and trying to include all aspects. And sometimes that works, but in our experience, it really does work better when it's built one piece at a time. And you need to think about what are the pieces that you're trying to build, again, thinking about how it's going to evolve and how you're going to engage in deliberate experimentation around those pieces at a time. And then just reiterating the slide that I showed previously, what some of those pieces might look like. So that's what we're going to be doing in the next couple slides, is to talking about what these pieces might look like and how you would use the framework and the scaffolding to guide the experimentation around these pieces. Now, one piece, and it says subsystem number one, and it doesn't have to be the one that you start with, but one piece is going to connect to the strategy. It's going to be, how do we align the work that we do in our area to what's important in the organization, and how are we trying to align that work? So here's what it might look like. You might say, okay, let's think about some sort of a strategy alignment subsystem. And I'm going to put it up here in the top around the align category. Just think about it as our framework. Now, here's the way that we've encouraged people to think about the scaffolding. And this is just an example of a simple document. As I mentioned, we teach a course on how do you work on the system and then work in the system around design and redesign of specific systems. And this is merely a shorthand version of what a team might use to say, okay, let's really try to create a good strategy alignment system. And the first thing they would do is they would say, okay, let's be clear. What does this system or this subsystem need to do? It needs to have a clear purpose. We need to think about what are the primary principles that we need to think about. we need to decide what behaviors we would like this system to drive. Now, typically when we do this, we talk about who are the key players in the system, and it might be leaders, managers, frontline. It might be various players in the system, but then we would list out what are the key behaviors that you would want to see this system produce, and then what are the outcomes that you would like to get. And then we turn our attention to working in the system and describing what are the process steps that you might see. Again, we're talking about the strategy alignment system. Starting really simple and thinking about what are the main tools that might be helpful. Talk a bit about triggers. We might talk about measures. We might talk about a renewal mechanism, which means how often are we going to review this. And again, I'm just showing you a quick sort of a guide that we've seen has been helpful with other organizations as they've been trying to say, let's experiment with one part of this system, and let's pick maybe strategy alignment as a beginning point. And let's use this as a guide to do some practice to see how we can build a better strategy alignment subsystem through experimentation. So that's an example of one subsystem. Now, another subsystem might be around visual management. Some people see these two subsystems as one and the same, and it isn't important that you see them as the same or different. It's just that you're trying to get some definition around what are the main components that I would see in an MDI system, and how can I start doing some experimentation. So again, as I said previously, here's some examples, and it's not the answer, it's just some examples about how you could use this as a guide to say, so visual management, what's its purpose? What's it supposed to do? What kind of principles are going to help me to think about good visual management? What kind of behaviors would I see if people really understood and were using daily visual management? What would I see happening? And what kind of outcomes would I get? And then I would experiment. I would think about, so what kind of process am I going to need in order to drive those behaviors and get those outcomes? What kind of tools are going to be helpful? What kind of triggers are going to be needed? How often am I going to see how this system is working, this subsystem? And when am I going to take a pulse and renew it and see how things are working? And all these things I'm mentioning in the working in the system, working on the system, again, you can read about them in the white paper that we wrote on systems by design. And also, as I said before, this is something that we teach people how to do through courses that we've put together to try to help guide this work and the experimentation. So we're just going to continue to talk about these subsystems in the next couple slides. Another subsystem might be around routine communication. So just a summary so far, you've got a connection to what your department does and what the organization is focused on. You have some way to visually know, am I ahead or behind? How are we performing? And now we have to have a routine way to talk about this, to communicate what's our status, how are we doing, what do we need to do to think about adjusting. So as I showed before, you would go through these routines as far as both working on the system, what's the purpose, what are the key principles I want to keep in mind, what behaviors would I see, and one thing you'll notice here is in this particular example, sometimes it's helpful to think about what good behavior is or what it is not. And so that's why we've listed it this way, what it is and what it isn't. And then again, some sort of process experimentation that you would do to say, how could we have a better communication subsystem? What's the process we need to experiment with? And then how do we track that and see, are we producing the kind of behaviors and outcomes that we want to see? And then you can add problem solving to this. And as I said previously, it might start off as an issue tracking system or an idea sharing system. It might be simply what are the problems and then what are the issues and then what ideas do we have to address those. And as it evolves, it may turn into more about root cause identification. So as I said before, let it evolve, start simple, evolve it the way that it's going to work for you. Using this as a guide, thinking in terms of what would be the purpose of routine problem solving. What key principles must I keep in mind in order to produce the kind of behaviors I want to see? And then what would those behaviors look like? And then turn your attention to experimentation. Let's create some sort of a process that's going to drive those behaviors. Think about the key tools that might be beneficial, starting simple. And then think about how would we measure our progress on, are we producing the behaviors we want? Have we generated ideas against issues? And then how do we regularly renew and review our status on our problem-solving system? And then the final subsystem I want to say something about today is, as people are improving the work, they may decide that some things need to be standardized. How would we go about doing that? Well, you can design it the way we've been talking about, is to think about what would be the purpose of a standardizing the work system or subsystem. Key behaviors to keep, or key principles to keep in mind, important behaviors that you would like to see, and also what standardization is not. And then, starting with a simple process, experiment. See how you could design a system to produce the kind of behaviors you want to see and the results you want to get, following the guide that I've been showing on the System by Design guide here. So I'm going to pause and just make this point, and I said it earlier, but I put numbers on those subsystems just to keep track of them, but it isn't important to say that's the only way that you can do it. I think it makes good sense to try to find out where the interest and the energy is. You always have something that's going on. It's not like we're creating things from scratch. People are already communicating. People are already doing some sort of problem solving. People are already doing some of these things. So start with what you have and think about where is the energy. If it's more in the enable section, then start with systems that are there. If it's more in the improve system section, start with systems there. Eventually you'll round it out and make sure that you have good coverage on all three corners of the framework. So again, I'm going to pause and review and see if this is making sense to folks. So what have I covered so far? So I've talked about a definition for managing for daily improvement, and then the framework, or the mindset and the framework and the scaffolding, just to think about how we're going to go about doing this. And then I describe the mindset as being one of thinking about evolution, evolving from simple to complex, thinking about a framework to assign or think about different subsystems around align, enable, and improve. And then using the scaffolding as a guide. Just one example of a scaffolding guide would be the Systems by Design framework. And then thinking about putting the different systems together, starting with a few and adding a few laters. This example of a template or guide is just, this is what it looks like. Anybody can create one of these. It's a simple Word document, just some sort of a framework and guide that can help to guide the work of looking at a subsystem. So I want to pause again. I'm going to unmute the phones and see if any questions have been brewing in your mind as far as any of the things that I've covered in any of this thus far. So I'm going to pause. You can put something in the chat function, or just ask any questions or make any comments. Does this seem to be something that, if people have tried this, does it work for you? What experience have you had in trying to design and create a MDI system?
Hey, Mike, this is Brian Taylor from WellSpan Health. How are you today?
Hi, Brian.
Just wanted to get your thoughts on the MDI system in that last slide there. Do you recommend starting in any particular spot, or starting with all of them, or what's your thoughts around that?
Well, I listed the direction starting with strategy alignment to begin with, because I think if people can start thinking about what are the important things that we need to work on, then they can take a tour around going the counterclockwise direction accordingly. But I don't think it has to be that way. I think that a manager talking with his or her team about the things that are of interest to them, They may say, if we already have some huddling going on, how can we improve our huddling? If we're already trying to improve some things, how can we improve how we improve? And then if you find that you've only got some of the pieces and you find that you've got a gap, maybe work on that gap so that you've got at least something going on that helps to align, something that helps to enable, and something that helps to improve. That's my general advice, but I'd be interested in the experience from any others on the call today. How have you seen it work, Brian, in your world?
Well, we've done a suite of tools all at once here.
Mm-hmm.
And this was the model that was embraced by ThedaCare there when we went up to see their daily improvement system.
Yeah, yeah, and it's not there's not a right or a wrong. I do know that if people see a complete picture and they try to emulate it and they haven't evolved it on their own, they may become overwhelmed with trying to do all the parts. And they probably have to find out where's the energy that we have and the interests that we have and where can we start. And knowing that it might look something like what someone else did, but maybe it won't be exactly like that.
I find here that we struggle with a strategy alignment piece at the unit department level because that's so new to everybody.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If I could go back in time and do it over again, I would probably just focus on the things, the tools that would be in play at the unit level, like the huddles, the standard work,
Right.
the stat sheet exchange, those type of tools.
Yeah, I think there's good wisdom there. And I think that if you can start with what you have and find out what people are getting at least some benefit out of, then you can help guide them and say, so are we improving the right things? How are we contributing to the work of the organization? What are the main things that we need to get done in this department in order to contribute to the work of the organization? So I think some of that probably has to be, what would you say, reverse engineered almost to try to say, how do we back into it that way?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good perspective. I really like that, Brian. And that's been my experience is just notice where there may be some gaps and try to address that. But I don't want to mislead people to think that there is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 step process here. I just merely gave numbers and tried to show how it might connect throughout in an organization or in a department. Any other
Mike,
Yes.
Yeah, Denise Weinberg from Kimberly Schools.
Hi.
Hi. So this tool has helped me really reflect on our journey and maybe understand the systems we have been working in and try to kind of map them out.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that's been interesting to me is when do you typically see organizations work in the middle? And I think that's what it confused me for a while because I kept trying to put everything in align, enable, improve, and we started to work right in the middle in the work systems.
Yeah.
When do organizations start to do that?
Well, I think in a way, they are working on the work system. So think about strategy alignment. If you say, so how are we performing relative to what we're trying to do? And so I know the work that you and your team are doing is you're trying to say, we've got some kids that are trying to learn. Some are not going as quickly as perhaps others are. And what do we need to do to experiment and adjust with the learning system that's going on either between a teacher and a student or with a student or within a classroom? And just by asking those questions, you're starting to already work in that middle part. You're already touching upon that. So we're always sort of, focusing and saying, so when we're communicating how are those work systems, or in your situation, those learning systems performing. When we talk about ideas to make them better, we are talking about those systems. And we talk about, okay, let's agree we're going to standardize some things. Standardize what? Well, we're standardizing the work systems. So
Okay.
I don't know if that's hitting the the point, but you're always trying to, that's why we put the work system in the middle, is what is it we're trying to affect? How do we align those? How do we really enable the people that are involved in those? And that's really got to be the focus. That's what it's all about. Good question, Noah. Thank you for that. Any other input? Okay, I'm going to move on to another section before we wind this down. And I want to just, if you've been involved in our webinars, just to reintroduce a framework that we've been thinking about, that it's beneficial to learn about, the Cynefin Sense-Making Framework. It's a Welsh word. It's a way to make sense of what kind of system are you dealing with. It is one of the most highly cited papers written or published by the Harvard Business Review, and you can learn more about it by going to that bit.ly link below. But how does it relate to what we're talking about here today? So when you think about this framework, you think about there are some systems that are more ordered on the right-hand side. There are some that are less ordered on the left-hand side. Those that are on the ordered side come in two parts. On the bottom, obvious, and the top, complicated. On the left, complex means that there's many moving parts and they're affecting each other, and it isn't always so easy to understand cause and effect. On the lower left-hand corner is a chaotic situation that you want to try to avoid. So what does this mean as far as experimenting with managing for daily improvement system? So many times it does start with many safe to fail experiments, similar with tools that we would like to experiment with. Let's try some things and see what happens. If we like what we see, we're going to give it energy and try to amplify it. If we don't like what we see, we're going to try to dampen it and try something else. So lots of little experiments are going to be tried. Some of those are going to start to connect, and you're going to start to see a cause and effect relationship. This is what happens when we track these measures, when we talk about it, when we try to do problem solving, when we try to standardize. Then you're starting to see a cause and effect relationship, and you can say, oh, now I can see how it might work for us, and you're kind of moving into the complicated domain. Sometimes you move back and situations change and you realize, well, we don't quite have it yet. We're not quite ready to move it forward. We still have some more experimenting to do. So you may go back and forth between those two domains. Sometimes you're going to say, I think we got it pretty well, and I think we should establish this as the current best way we're going to do something, and we're going to call that the standard work. And sometimes, even when we establish the current best way we're going to do something, something new comes along and causes us to improve that and say, okay, that worked for a while, but now we're going to go back and study it, think about cause and effect, and maybe improve it a little bit more. And you may even go back into the complex domain and say, well, we need to run some more experiments. So these are the dynamics of how the Cynefin model framework works. And the point I want to make here is we have to be careful about trying to overly constrain or move too quickly to standardize something and say, okay, this is the way we are going to do this, or this is the way we are all going to do this. Because what happens if you move too closely to that boundary between obvious and chaotic, that is like a steep cliff that'll thrust you down into the chaotic zone. It comes about because people are forced to do something that doesn't make sense to them, or we've given too many constraints, too much structure. We have moved too quickly, but we have not done enough experimenting. We haven't involved people enough. They haven't really owned what's going on. And we run the risk of then moving into chaos, where again, people find themselves managing through workarounds, firefightings, and heroic efforts. So I find this guide to be very helpful. Again, you can learn more about it by going to the bit.ly link. We'll be having more to integrate with the Cynefin Sense-Making Framework as we move forward. I found it to be very helpful. Another thing to think about is system or subsystem maturity. And we think in terms of Starting simple, what does a level 1 maturity look like? It looks like experimentation. It looks like people trying things. Simple, safe to fail experiments, like what I just mentioned with the Cynefin framework. So this is what it might look like. We're doing experiments, we're trying different tools, we're seeing how it works. So that's a level 1 maturity. A level 2 maturity is when we start to see that things are starting to connect. Habits are starting to form. People are showing up for meetings and they're not having to be prompted. We know what we're going to be talking about. People are engaged in problem solving. People are engaged in idea sharing. It's still somewhat manager dependent, so the manager needs to be there and needs to be guiding it. But we're starting to move into something that looks like initial integration. Level 3 maturity starts to look like this, where the habits are even more solidified. There's less dependent upon the manager. The manager doesn't need to be there, and the problem solving still occurs. The huddles still occur. The documents are kept up to date. Things become more fluid. You start to see it as a whole system, and you're starting to move into more of a functional integration level. So again, thinking in terms of gardening and growing it, it had to start at level 1. It needed to go through level 2 in order to get to level 3. What do we see in reality? Well, not all of those systems are necessarily at the same level of maturity. You're going to see some 1s, some 2s, some 3s. And again, that goes to the point about where do you see the gaps and where do you need to put your attention in order to try to get the whole system to be at a similar level of maturity. Now, here's another concept to think about. If you think about the left-hand side and the different roles early on, you're probably going to have strong management involvement. This is something that currently the managers are doing a lot of the problem solving. The communication is dependent upon them. Any connection to strategy is strongly in their court. They may also be doing a lot of the standardizing the work. So a heavy role being played by the manager. Over time, we would like to see more of that to be transferred over so the frontline staff are doing that work because they're being developed to be the future managers. What do we see in practice? It isn't so linear. It tends to go up. It tends to go down. It isn't always one step forward at a time. Many times there's backward steps. In addition to that, at any point in time, the energy may go back to zero. And this is a close-up view about what that might look like. And there's two perspectives here, one by Dr. W. Edwards Deming, who said no system will manage itself, so every system needs constant energy and infusion put into it. And James Womack said it this way: all processes have a desperate desire to head toward chaos, to get worse fast. And the only thing standing in the way is management. So at any point in time, things might go back to the previous state, and that's why constant attention needs to be paid by managers in order to be attending to this, to make sure that it doesn't go to chaos, that it is moving upward into the direction that you want it to go. Now, another question comes up, and it's a good question, is, are those 5 the only subsystems? Well, I only picked those as examples of subsystems. And there's many subsystems that people might experiment with and put into this. People might say we need to think about a voice of the customer system. Recognition system is certainly something that's important, because we know when we recognize people for the things that we would like to see, you're likely to get more of that. If we recognize people for the firefighting heroic efforts and workaround, that's what we're going to get more of. Idea generation and sharing, I said, is sometimes a precursor to problem solving. Training and retraining, when you develop standard work, you need to train people in the new way to do things. Retraining existing people in that might be an important system there. Education, as distinct from training, how are you developing people, might be a system. Coaching could be a system that helps to enable people. You might develop an experiment with a coaching system. Waste identification is also something that can help to support improvement. 5S could be a system that's going to help with this. You might get into value stream analysis. You might be doing value stream analysis within a department or between departments. And really, any of these concepts can be worked between departments that partner with each other that want to improve common work systems. Problem escalation might be something you want to build into this. Process observation, some people call it a Kamishibai system, using a Kamishibai board. Auditing the standard work to see if people are following the standard work. So there's lots of systems that can be added here. And the caution is, do we need all of these? No, perhaps not. This could become overwhelming. But I think people need to think about, if we want to try to get to where we want to go, are there some gaps and are there some subsystems that might be beneficial to help us to align the work and to enable people to do the work and to improve the work. So I just offer this as some possible systems or subsystems that people may want to think about experimenting with, in addition to the ones that I described previously. So here's a final review, just to think a little bit about these things. I reintroduced this idea of the Cynefin Sense-Making Framework. I personally find it very beneficial. People can learn more about it at the link that I provided. System maturity, we talked about when you look at the frequency, intensity, the duration, scope, and the role of the ideal behaviors, you can think in terms of different levels of maturity and how do you always try to move that maturity forward. And trying to avoid the problem of everything going back to zero if management is not putting the energy into it and trying to develop that in the direction you want to go. Other subsystems that may be added to the MDI system were also talked about here. So here's some final words of advice. I've tried to sprinkle these throughout in the webinar. Start with what you have. If you've got huddles, start with huddles, see how you can improve huddles. If you've got some visual management, start with what you have. Start with the tools that you have. Try to keep it simple. I know some of the things I introduce might seem to be complex, but don't overly complicate them. Use them as guides to try to help you to improve. And then try to be the gardener as opposed to being the mechanic, to try to evolve this in the direction that you would like to take it. So I want to pause again and see if there's any questions from anyone on any of the topics that we've talked about in the course of the last 50 minutes together. Okay, I'll take that as we're ready to move on. So what happens next? This webinar recordings, if you go to our website page, is going to be moved into the previous events, so you'll be able to find the recording there. Everyone that was on the recording or the webinar today will get a link to the recording, so you'll have access to it and the information that we provided. Next month in April, I'm going to be talking about a leader standard work system, part 1, similar to what we talked about today. So we're kind of working on a couple things simultaneously, managing for daily improvement and the leader standard work system. I mentioned previously that Didier Rubino on May the 17th is going to provide some advice on frontline leader standard work. He's got some great advice in this regard, so you can learn more about that by going to that bit.ly link. I got several topics that are in the works. You can see them listed here. And I mentioned the 2 white papers that we're developing. If anyone wants to see the current draft of what we have and provide any input, all you need to do is send me an email and get a copy of that draft. I've gotten a lot of input so far from a lot of great thought leaders in this regard. So watch for those to be published shortly. And then we're also doing the principle of the month, and you can access this a couple of the ways. One is at our blog post on our website, and also one is through LinkedIn on my LinkedIn page. And we've covered a couple principles thus far. In January, we have 5 reflections on the principle of constancy of purpose. So you can go to the bit.ly links on our IEX blog on the left-hand side, or if you prefer LinkedIn, you can see what we talked about in January. We had 5 reflections on constancy of purpose. In February, we did reflections on respect every individual, and you can see the topics that we discussed there. In the month of March, we've done 2 thus far, one on focus on process, and we're going to do these roughly every week. So you can watch for those. You can use these links to go back to the previous ones that perhaps you missed. I always ask this question if anyone has any topics that they would like to share. I already listed a couple of topics that are in the works, but if you have something that you would like to share or would like to have covered, we'll convene people to talk about the important topics you would like to discuss. So that's it for today. I hope everyone has a good day. Watch for the recording coming your way. Thanks again for your time today, folks.